our inner critic is fueled by our fears, our past experiences. And when that inner critic goes off, it triggers certain parts of our brain. Chemicals are released to put us in that space of survival, which is why we get tense when we're talking about the inner critic or it starts going. We oftentimes end up holding our breath.
Hey, 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 you are now tuned in to the It's the Human Experience podcast. Listen, if you are not already following us, go ahead and scroll up to the top and hit that follow button so you don't miss out on episodes like this. Today, we have Des on the podcast, and I'm going to jump right in. I'm not going to wait at all to give you any kind of fluff. I want to make sure we get into the heart of who Des is. So that is the first thing I want to know. Let the listeners know, who is Des?
Des, me, I'm an advocate for the inner child, and I'm no stranger to trauma. And I feel like I've lived so much of my life on the dark side that I'm now really grateful to be in my journey of light and to be sharing that with other people. I think I'm compassionate. I'm a sucker for puns. I think they're punderful, and just supporting everyone to feel safe in their own mind.
Yeah, I love that. And I can definitely, sometimes I do little pun analogies myself. So I'll have to keep that in mind as we're talking. If you can describe yourself in like 3 words, how would you describe yourself?
I would describe myself as a visionary, as grit got brought up earlier. And I think that's something that at the core is really something that I love, that energy, that momentum of not necessarily grinding, but the energy of grit, of perseverance. And that third word I would say is just safe. I really advocate on being just a safe place for others and for myself.
Yeah, I love that for you. I think I want to go into your inner child work, right? So talk to us a little bit about what you do and what led you to join that journey.
Yeah, so I'm an embodiment coach and somatic practitioner, and I specialize in inner child work and trauma related things as well. And it's so funny because I started this journey in psychology. I have 2 degrees, but I was so unhappy with the psychology movement. It just felt like there was so much awareness that was being brought to people's attention without definitive action steps. I was mirroring this woman, and she's like, I've had this client for 6 years. And I just remember thinking, that's not the point of therapy, right? Like to have someone for that long. So I hung up my psych shoes and ended up getting back into healing, as a burlesque teacher, actually. So I started teaching burlesque and boylesque in Prague, Czech Republic. And there I got certified as a dance movement therapist to really help people feel the weight of societal expectations come off with each layer. And then my own healing kind of demanded my attention. I was in chronic pain and I had sciatica to the point where I was falling on crosswalks because of the pain. And I was an overachiever, dare I say a perfectionist. And I just realized, one day covered on a dirty theater floor in shame and guilt, I just remember thinking, if I could be anybody, if I could be Des, who would that even be? I realized I'd been living my life for other people for so long. And that's really when I started doing my own journey. And I was scared. Healing seemed like it was for everybody else but Des. And I met a woman who introduced me to inner child work. And that was probably the scariest thing that I had ever done, was going back to those childhood moments of trauma, of neglect, and learning how to heal those trapped emotions that were in my body.
Yeah, I appreciate your transparency in really sharing that, because so many people, to your point, not even so many people, we all walk around with inner child trauma and triggers, and then patterns show up in our day-to-day lives, and we don't understand why we're reacting to certain things. And really sitting with your younger self and sometimes letting them know that we're okay. Like, or identifying what it is that would bother us in the past is really helpful to our healing now. It's funny because I have another podcast episode that we talked a little bit about. I was talking to a principal, and we talked a little bit about how we don't realize from a child, in terms of our interactions that we have with them, how we're molding the rest of their lives in the things that we're saying to them, right? And
Yeah.
it's so important that not only when we're thinking about how we communicate to children, and that's very, very, very important because that's where it all starts, but in our everyday conversation with people, we're creating wounds and our words are either healing or hurting. And it's so important, like the work that you're doing, because it's a whole problem.
Yeah. And, I love that acknowledgement of how it shows up in our life. Because I think we all have these childhood experiences. I know that the T word trauma can be a little triggering for some people. But if we just look at trauma through like the lens, of not having our needs met, then things start to open up a little bit. Maybe that teacher who told you you weren't going to be a good job, or who told you that unless you got straight A's, you were never going to make it. We internalize all of these things as children, and we don't realize the impact that it has on us as adults. And next thing you know, we're being emotionally reactive. We're procrastinating. We're afraid of conflict. We want things to be perfect. We're highly critical of ourselves. And we feel like it's our fault. It's my fault that I'm thinking these things. Why is this continuing to happen to me? And we end up feeling like we're the broken piece of the puzzle because we don't know what that origin story is that's causing all of this emotional and even psychological discomfort.
Yeah. I think I wanna sit in that self-sabotage,
Yeah.
right? And
Mm.
because I feel like a lot of people don't even realize that they're self-sabotaging. They feel as though it is healthy to be critical of themselves in a way that they would never be critical of people that deserve to be criticized.
And
It's an issue.
it is, because what we're telling ourselves subconsciously every time our friend comes to us with a problem, and then we come to ourselves with a problem, we're like, idiot. It's like, geez, whoa, that's not nice. But I think it's not our fault, whether we grew up in a very highly critical family, or maybe you brought home a B plus and they're like, well, why not an A? But we live in a culture that is so critical. We live in a loud, stimulated world of judgment, of comparison, of rub some dirt in it, and so we're not taught how to lovingly look at ourselves. And self-sabotage, imposter syndrome, like perfectionism, the not enough mindset, that's actually also statistically proven to be more of a struggle for women. And again, just thinking about these societal influences that we take in, as a young adult, child, adult, is very much rub some dirt in it. Don't talk about your problems, push through it. Don't be too much.
Yeah. That "don't be too much" is such an issue, and it's funny because I talk about this in another episode a little bit too by myself. The Barbie movie, I watched the Barbie movie. Have you seen it?
Not yet.
And so I won't give too much away, but I'll say that one part in it really spoke to the fact that as women, there is never a balance. It's either you're too aggressive or you're too quiet. You're too big or you're too small. You're too tall or you're too short. You're too laid back or you're too much. And it's almost that how do you even balance not being overly critical when we live in a world that criticizes everything you do, especially as a woman?
Yeah. And then on the flip side, you start taking like self care or self love, or I'm talking about myself in these positive ways. Maybe I'm even, you know, celebrating, because that's something that we get so disconnected from as well, is celebrating the things that we do. We end up having short lived achievement periods because we're in that mindset of what's next.
Mhm.
And especially as women, I think there's this fear of if we do celebrate ourselves, now we're going to be, getting labeled as vain or full of ourselves. So we aren't taught how to lovingly look at ourselves in the mirror.
Yeah.
And I think it really shows in our adult perspective in lives and our internal dialogue. And again, it's not our fault.
Yeah, it really isn't. It's so funny though, because I was listening to my husband the other day kind of talk through the definition of not a narcissist. I'm trying to think of the word and who he was referring to, just the way that we describe ego in a negative way, when in fact, when you look at the definition, it's actually a positive thing to be able to have that level of confidence. Like confidence is a good thing. It is not a bad thing. Even when it's at its top, you're supposed to look at yourself as the best, as the person that has a lot to offer. Of course, identifying areas of opportunity and improvement and working towards it because we're imperfect, right? We're human. But at the same time, we shouldn't be in a place to where nothing we do is good enough because we live with ourselves every day, all day. And we don't want to live in that kind of environment. So it's almost like really thinking to yourself, what kind of environment am I creating for myself? You wouldn't walk into someone's house and allow yourself to be in their environment that's creating negativity. So why do you create that for yourself every day?
And, what I'm hearing, what's coming up in hearing you is choice. I think so many of us don't feel like we have a choice in our thought patterns, or choice in our behaviors, a choice in what's going on in the world around us. And I think, especially for women, this idea of kind of martyrdom, which is something that's really been given to us at such a young age of, it's the woman's struggle to go through these things. But whether you're a woman or a man or however you identify, I think the world that we live in, because of the loud stimulation, the judgment, comparison, and criticism, we just feel like we don't have choice anymore. We are slowly starting to build these pathways of our brain that are getting used to, I don't want to say giving away our choice, but just into feeling like the things that are happening around us are so outside of our control that what's the point of even trying? Navigating that voice in my head is so difficult. What's the point of trying? I have to do the research. I don't know how to do it. Women coming home to themselves, not taught how to do it. So again, how are we able to really feel like we have a choice when we don't have the tools? And because it's so heavy, it feels so heavy, ending self-sabotage, creating that healthy environment for ourselves, because it means we have to learn how to do it too. Now there's so many moving pieces to the puzzle. I'm just going to sit down on the couch.
Yeah. The question I wanted to ask you is, so our everyday woman just starting to learn how to find themselves, what do you say are some simple tips or strategies to really come into who you are in the world of social media, and so many ways to get distracted into thinking that things that other people are doing are supposed to be things that you should be doing? How would you say that they can actually work on figuring out who they are so that they can be authentic to themselves?
The first thing that I always invite people to do is validate yourself. Validation allows you to feel seen and heard. And the truth is, we don't get enough validation in the world. And learning how to validate ourselves really starts to build our internal muscle of self-worth, trust, and confidence. It shows us, hey, even though other people around us might not be seeing and hearing us, I see and hear you. I see myself. So learning how to validate ourselves. And for anybody who's like, Hazel, Des, I snoozed my alarm 10 times today. I can't validate myself. Something that's really powerful for that is to connect to the why. You snoozed your alarm 10 times. Why did you do it? Oh, because you had a late night with your friends, because you woke up with anxious thoughts. When we're validating ourselves and giving our space that celebration, that's a beautiful journey. On the flip side, when we want to go into that space of criticism, connecting to the why, this is why this thing happened. Because once you know your why, then you get to take empowered action. If you're just like, I snooze my alarm 10 times, the spiral of inner criticism, now you don't get to take empowered action. Now you're just stuck in shame and guilt.
That's so true. Because to your point, when you reflect on that why, you can say, you know what? Tomorrow I'm going to go to sleep a little bit earlier. I'm going to make sure I don't engage in whatever activities with whatever people if it caused whatever issue with me. And so, really being able to sit in that. And to your point about validation, I think that I want to touch on that as well as something else you shared as well, in terms of as human beings being overachievers and always looking up. And I could definitely say that I suffered from that whole looking up thing. I'm going to go back to school and do XYZ. I've done it. Okay, now what's next? I'm looking up. And it's always a look up instead of looking in front of you and looking at the things that you've accomplished. And when you think about validation and inner child work, it's looking back at your story and your journey and saying, you know what? Look at where I've come from. Look at what I've come out of. Look at where I am today. I think that constant theme I see on social media, so social media is good sometimes, is we're living out some of our biggest dreams right now. And it's giving ourselves that validation that, wait, it's not as bad as I think it is. I'm actually doing some great things. And I think when you validate that for yourself, you can create a safe home for yourself in your brain when I say home.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the flip side of what we were talking about, of how, because the world that we live in is so loud and so judgmental, even from a young age, we're taught, shoot for the moon, at least you'll land on the stars, or, go big or go home. And so from a young age, we're really taught to kind of overachieve. We're taught how to hustle, and we're compared to our classmates. Maybe some of us were even compared to our siblings. So we grow up comparing ourselves, criticizing ourselves, because we think that that's what's normal. We think that it's safe. And for anybody who's like, I'm validating myself, or even when my husband or wife tells me, hey, like, you're doing an amazing job, sometimes we don't even believe it. We're like, no, no, like, we undermine we undermine our achievements. I had a client who had just done a 10K, and someone's like, wow, that's amazing. And she's like, oh, it really wasn't that big of a deal, and instantly undermines herself. Because again, I think just the pattern in our mind, like that pathway in our brain that is stay small,
Yeah.
is something that's so difficult and so habitual. And this gentle invitation to validate can be so transformational, and it can be a little scary
Yeah.
learning how to do it. But I love that, your honesty and authenticity. I think that what's next look up is something that we all struggle with, because that's the world around us. The world around us isn't teaching us how to be in the now. It's
Yeah.
having us prep for the then, the what ifs.
In the future. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think something that came up for me and everything that you just shared is really something that I talked about in season one, and the importance of creating incremental small goals, right? Small goals and steps every day leads us to the bigger path. I think that when we think about mental health and really just being overly critical for ourselves, is many people set big goals, they don't set small goals. So when we think about the celebration for ourselves, and we think about the fact of you're looking up for what next, and you're not being mindful and sitting in what's actually happened now, it's really going back to how you even set your goals and create values for yourself. Because if you start small, then when I actually got up and went to the gym today, or when I decided that I was going to do self care once this month, then I'm able to check off little things along the journey and feel fulfilled and satisfied that I'm staying true to myself. But when you just say, hey, Hazel, I want you to, I don't know, run a marathon, to your point. Listen, that's not going to happen. I'm only considering the fact that, did you run the marathon at the rate in which you said you were going to do it? As opposed to, I have to go to the gym every day to build up that endurance, to build up that muscle, to be able to get through. And so if I've gone 4 times that week and my goal was 3, like, it's clap, clap time for myself. And many times we don't think about the little things that we're doing every day that's bringing us closer to our end goal, so that we can show up for ourselves in a way to where we can validate ourselves. So I felt like in what you were saying, it's so important that people realize that you have to create small goals, because if you only create the big goals and you don't identify the small steps to get there, you'll then feel like there's nothing to celebrate when you've been doing it every day.
Exactly. And I love that you brought that up. That was the first episode of yours, actually, that I ever listened to, was that one. And
Yeah.
so I really feel like the alignment of you bringing it up. And, a couple of things came up. One, I love the idea of having those small measurable goals that are more attainable, that don't feel so overwhelming or so resisting in the body. And something that can be really powerful in connecting to those goals, especially, small, big, again, we're encouraging small incremental goals, everybody, is to connect to your why, connect to the desire. Okay, you want to go to the gym 3 times a week. Why? What is the desire? How do you want to feel? We live in a world that really pushes so much value on external reward and external things. So next thing you know, we want to go to the gym 3 times a week, or, we want to get, 3 new clients a month. And then when that goal isn't met, oh, I only went 2 times. Oh, I only got 1 client. The criticism starts. Well, we had this expectation, this goal turned into an expectation that became really rigid. And we put so much on it without even realizing it. And then we connect it to our self-worth oftentimes. Oh, I didn't meet my goal. It must be that inner critic because I'm a failure, because I'm so lazy, because nobody wants to hire me. But when we can connect to the desire and our why, I'm going to the gym because honestly, how I feel after that desire, like what is that emotion? I feel relief. I feel strong. I have more energy for my kids, for my family. Why do I want 3 clients? It's not that I necessarily want to make more money, like get to that deeper why, that deeper desire, because I want to make more impact, because I want to feel like I'm talking to people and it's mattering. And it changes. Well, I only went to the gym twice. But man, did I feel good every time I went. And that one time I didn't go, why didn't I go? Because I chose to do this other thing instead. Coming back to that choice and validation. I only got 1 client, but man, I did so much networking. I know that I impacted people. And so really getting a little bit looser on our criticism that can come from not meeting those really hard, rigid external goals that we set for ourselves, but connecting to them to something deeper so we can really feel that intrinsic motivation to achieve them.
Yeah. I think that we talked about so much around our self critic, right? But there's so much external noise too. So I want to broaden out the conversation in really talking through in a world of social media, we touch on that a little bit, in the world of family and friends, in terms of naysayers, myths, and things that you've heard along the way. What are some things you had to really comb through to get to the point of where you are today?
Yeah, so like I said, when I was on that dirty theater floor, I realized I'd been living my life for other people. If you would have asked me who's Des, I would have had no idea, and I think that was really difficult for me because so much of my life in my childhood, I come from a multi-generational military family household. So it was rigid. It was perfectionism. It was get it on the dot or else there's danger. And so I grew up with this idea of part of my identity, like I'm a soldier, I'm strong, I'm a warrior, I'm the oldest sister, so I'm wise and responsible. In 2014, I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Now I'm a person who's got BPD. I've got a distorted sense of self. I've got fear of abandonment, all the labels that came with that. Plus, I'm a woman, so I'm sensitive, emotional, too much. And every time someone gave me a label, whether I want to admit it or not, I took it. I was so quick to take the labels that people were giving me because I didn't know who I was. I hadn't been taught how to explore who I was. I was taught to be successful. And to be successful meant your life is meant to look like this.
Yeah.
And so I took everybody else's labels until one day, years of chronic pain on that floor is when I really realized it. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm so tired. I'm literally laying on the floor because it's the only place I can find support right now, because I'm living so many different labels. And it took such a journey of sitting in it. You talked about sitting in a couple of times with our goals, and that was so hard because I think we get so uncomfortable. We live in such a fast world. Sitting in your identity takes time. And no, we're not taught to love the journey. We're taught to want the reward.
Yeah.
And so that combing was messy. There were so many knots. And the wild thing was I feel like I'd spent so much of my life combing through the knots, of these labels. And then what I realized was I'm just combing a wig. I just take the wig off. And underneath is really who I was. I was trying to work through who does is as a perfectionist, who does is as a soldier. It's like, actually, none of this is mine. I'm going to take all of it off and I'm just going to see what fills my cup up and maybe lean into that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that what you talked about is so relevant for people everywhere, right? In terms of like taking on the labels that other people have given you. I think that's something that I do want to share is something with my oldest daughter. I think that she's often shared with me through the years that she doesn't feel like she relates or identifies with people. And so she's often ran towards the labels. Like she's on the internet trying to figure out what's going on with her. Mommy, I have ADHD. I'm like, okay, you can look it up. That's nice, but we're not going to own the label because I feel like what happens too much in a world that we're trying to figure out what click, what label, what thing we identify with, we are looking for a place of community and then we start to own the label, right? So now I have ADHD and I'm known that I don't really pay attention to things, or maybe I'm hyper focused, or so now I embody that. Like I'm going to be the poster child for ADHD. And I'm like, we're not doing that. Like I'm not entertaining that. Whatever it says that you can be good at or bad at, know that if you make a decision to your point of choice to be good or bad at it, you can be good or bad at it. And if you make a decision that that is not going to be you, then that is not going to be you. And so I just crushed it, not even trying to dismiss what she was feeling, but to help her understand that I'll sit with you in this trying to figure out who you are thing, but know that everything is a choice. We choose to show up for ourselves in a way that allows us to accomplish whatever goals and set whatever values we have for ourselves. And we're not going to allow a textbook or a person to define who we are. To your point of what you shared, it sounds like it took a lot of reflection work to validate what feels good to you. And that's the only label you're going to own is a label that you've done enough work with to where you pull back the layers and said, this feels like me. I feel good in this shell. I feel happy in this shell. Of course, there's going to be turmoil that happens along the way and kind of shakes you up and all the things. But this feels right for me, not because the internet said this is me, not because a doctor said this is me, not because my parents said this is me, but this is what feels like me.
Yeah, and thank you, for holding that container for your daughter because it is so difficult, especially with the younger generation. I work a lot with like teens around self-worth outside of social media because it's such a different world that they are living and growing up in. And again, it's so hard because in school, we're given labels from the very beginning. Are you an A student? Are you a B student? Are you a good kid or a bad kid? Are you a troublemaker? Are you the class clown? So we get these labels at such a young age, and the brain loves compartmentalizing. And we want to take the labels that people around us are giving that we love and trust because we want to be included in the community. We're not taught to own things that are truly ours, like, oh, I'm a quirky sense of, I've got a quirky sense of humor and I love talking to plants. It's like, well, that's weird. Like, because we don't want to feel like we're standing outside of the box, especially when we're younger. And we don't have the tools to process the anxiety that comes from discovering who we are. Because in that space of discovering who we are, we're sitting with ourselves and we're doing things that the people around us probably aren't doing. Another invitation for people is just to, set aside a time once a week. I invite you to do it every day, even if it's for 60 seconds, and just ask yourself, how am I feeling right now? How am I feeling? Has, what's going on? And what's my desire or my dream? But ask yourself like 2 or 3 questions every day just to start opening up that dialogue because, little circle here of when we're talking about our desires, our dreams, the labels that we want to take on. If we've had anybody in our life that has made us feel less than or judged us or somebody who's ridiculed someone who's what we want, who we feel we are,
Mhm.
oh, that person's really quirky. And then the kids in the playground are like, well, Sally's so weird. It's like, oh, shoot, I think Sally's pretty cool. I want to do that, but now I'm not going to. That desire, that inner heart of ours that speaks with passion and love, We're afraid to share it because we don't want it to get stifled. So what we do instead is we push it down. I'm going to swallow my words because that voice of desire, of dream, it's too scary. What if I get judged? What if I get rejected? No, no, no. Silence it down. And then the inner critic gets the microphone instead.
It's so true. It's so true. And it's so sad because to your point, like that voice shows up everywhere from we're little till we pass, right? And I don't think people spend enough time in honoring that voice. Like your subconscious mind is always talking to you and telling you, like, this feels right, this feels wrong. And it's kind of like there's so much cliche to where people make it seem like it's evident. And I'm only speaking to like as a younger child where it's a good and bad. And it's not that, it's not like that, honey.
It doesn't have to be, there's a journey, it's a journey and it's not good or bad. Like also good and bad is so subjective. Like just like perfect, like perfectionist, like your idea of perfect is going to be different than mine. But yeah, we get so black and white. And again, it's that brain that's like, yes or no, safe or not safe. And it's normal to go into that space. And I think so many of us are afraid to talk about that voice in our head because we're like, I don't know, Hazel, mine's pretty mean. Like, if I told you what my inner critic said, it'd be terrifying. It's like, that's the truth for all of us. Our inner critic is fueled by our fears, our past experiences. And when that inner critic goes off, it triggers certain parts of our brain. Chemicals are released to put us in that space of survival, which is why we get tense when we're talking about the inner critic or it starts going. We oftentimes end up holding our breath. Plus, there's all this other stuff in the brain. It's like, I like to imagine as like a monkey, it's just kind of like jumping from all the different memories in your brain. And it's like memory recall bias. But what it's doing is it's going to all of the different trees of memory that are inside of you. And it's picking the bananas that validate whatever the inner critic is saying. So next thing you know, your inner critic has a big list of all the reasons why you're a failure. And you're like, dang, that must be true. But if you look at the one thing on the evidence list, you realize it was part of a bigger story.
Hmm.
And I think that's a big thing for women, and I'm partnering with an amazing woman around this that is, if we don't own our story, our true story, then somebody else will own it for us.
Hmm.
And I think that's the story of the inner critic. If we don't own our narrative, then that inner critic is going to take it, plot twist it, and say, this is who you really are.
Yeah. And to your point, I feel like for me, that's why it's so important to show up as my authentic self. Because when you show up as your authentic self, like you don't feel any kind of way about what you're doing because you're not pretending. You know that you're owning your story. And I think in my mom passing, it made me realize like, I don't want to die with my story. I was always vulnerable and transparent before, but this is my story. And no matter if it's something that it doesn't sound right and fit right with you, as long as I'm being honest and vulnerable to where my intentions are pure and I'm sharing it out of knowing that there are other versions of myself out there in the world, and me holding on my story really doesn't help other people get to where they're trying to go faster because they're out there feeling alone. They're out there feeling like, wow, there's nobody like me, to the point of what we talked about people trying to find a label, a box, or something to hold on to. If you don't share your story, you're not helping someone validate that it's okay for them to be themselves. So I want to ask you, like, what do you do to stay true to your authentic self?
Well, I set aside time for myself regularly. I have coaching sessions with myself as well as a self date. And I think I have to remember to come home to who I am. Because, coming back to even the name of your podcast, it's the human experience. And we are so communal and so societal based and driven that we disconnect from our human experience and we get caught up in the societal experience. And so for me to stay authentic to myself, I have to create that time for myself because I'm empathetic as fudge. I will get caught up in the storm of emotions that are around me. And if I don't nurture my own needs, if I don't take the time to say, hey, like, what's been going on? What's one weird thing that you've been wanting to do that you haven't really been doing because you're afraid people are going to judge you? The answer, stilts. Um, but really, that's how I stick to my authentic self. I make time for it. And I honor that time the same way I would honor a business meeting, an appointment at the bank. I show myself that I matter just as much as other appointments.
Hmm.
And if it's 45 minutes and 30 minutes in, I'm feeling that restless energy, I hold that 15 minutes for myself and I hold myself in that restless energy. And I say, it's okay to be restless. Just like I would soothe a child. It's okay to be restless. I know we want to look up. I know we want to go into what's next, but this time that we have together, it's sacred and it's ours. And I want to honor it. And so I sit with it until it goes away, until I come home and I call my energy back.
Yeah. What would you say to someone that's just starting out on their journey and they're trying to figure out who they are? They're trying to let go of some of that self sabotage. They want to work on their inner child. What would you say to them? That. What would you say to them?
You know, what I would say is just make space and time for the discovery process. Make space and time for the discovery process. Start to validate yourself. Start to ask yourself the question, what's one thing I can validate myself for today? I made a delicious cup of coffee. And how am I feeling right now? Just start asking yourself those two gentle questions to start building in some of that muscle memory of trust and self worth. Anybody who writes or is thinking about writing or is resistant to writing, I also encourage everyone to write, because what happens is our brain can turn into a broken record going so fast with ideas. And when we have a pen and paper, it slows down our regulation, because when we're going into our journey of discovering who we are, it can be scary. We can be like, one of my clients is like 67 and she's like, my husband died and I have no idea who I am. I don't think I've ever known. It can be scary starting the process, but connect to your why and know that it's your experience and it's your journey. And to just write, to see what comes up, stream of consciousness, no judgment, but just let everything flow out, because it's also going to regulate the nervous system. And for anybody who's really interested around inner child work, I would always recommend getting a coach or someone who's qualified to kind of guide you through that journey. Because when we work with the inner child or the body, we never really know what's going to happen. So making sure that before we dive deeper into our story, the nitty gritty pieces that we've been suppressing for so long, to have a regular intention of coming home, of compassion, and to have someone who can really support you in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. This was such great conversation. We talked about so many things. So many gems were dropped. But where can the listeners find you online?
So you can find me on social media on really any platform under Des Caminos. I'm also the owner of the Interconnected Self and the Inner Trust Academy. So if you Google the interconnectedself.com, my website will pop up there too.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Des. I really appreciate you sharing your story, sharing such valuable and tactical gems for the audience to be able to apply and really find themselves. And definitely follow Des online, reach out to her, look for her. Being able to find people in the world that really wants to pour and support you along your journey is really hard to come by. And so I appreciate you joining us on the podcast today.
And thank you so much, Hazel, because, it's just the reminder that there are people out there who are like minded, who are stepping into this movement, this revolution that is authenticity, and coming home to our human experience and breaking away from some of the societal pressures of the world. So thank you and the community for listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, I have to solicit everyone. If you're not already following us, please go ahead and scroll up to the top. If you're listening to us from Apple or YouTube, go ahead and make sure that you subscribe and follow us. This was an absolute amazing conversation. So we want to hear all about your takeaways and your feedback. Go ahead and leave that down in the comments for us because I would love to bring Des back if there's more value that she can add for the audience. And then as always, just make sure you're staying true to yourself. And thank you so much for listening to the It's the Human Experience podcast.